We are live now, ma'am.
Good morning, students. So we have completed 5 lectures, and this is the 6th and final lecture on astrophysics. I think you have been introduced to quite a few new topics that you have not earlier been aware of. But so today we will learn a bit more of new things, and these are more topics of current research. And today we'll learn a bit about how stars and planets are formed, and then focus a bit more on planets around other stars, because those are, as you know, a hot topic in research now, as I will tell you later. So we have been talking about the matter between the stars, and we have talked about the stars, but then where do the stars come from? Essentially, they come from the matter between the stars, which is the interstellar medium. And so this gives us basically a first glimpse of what the interstellar medium could be like. And if you recall, yesterday when I was talking about the interstellar medium, I was actually I mentioned that there is some part of the interstellar medium, or one phase of the interstellar medium, where the hydrogen is molecular. And these are the regions which are dense and cold, and hence conducive to formation of structures. And it is in such structures which are known as molecular clouds, because of the shape. So anything which is like fuzzy and shaped thing, we call that cloud. So these molecular clouds, within these molecular clouds, because of reasons, some of which we understand and others we do not, there can be formation of high density cores. And this could be forming spontaneously, or this could also be forming due to some external trigger, like it could be that due to some compression, due to events like supernovae, etc. And as a result of which, these cores, once they become dense, they contract under their own gravitation. And then they evolve. What happens is that the density at the core becomes higher, larger. So there is a radial gradient of the density. Since the density at the core is the highest, that part collapses faster. You will know about the free fall time as it goes over, right? So that part collapses faster, and that is called an inside out collapse. And this is this core at this point could be considered to be an isothermal sphere, and the singular term here means that basically the density is undefined at the center, because the density actually increases as 1 over r square. So you assign some fixed density at the center and scale the thing accordingly. Okay, so then what happens? So you have this cloud or the core which starts to collapse. So there are 2 phases of this collapse. First of all, what happens is that this larger core, it collapses, and then since the central part, it has a higher density, it collapses faster, and soon a very small stellar core forms there. And then this as it is falling, this nebula, and also the other thing is that all the objects in the universe, basically they have an angular momentum, and so this molecular core that is formed here is actually, it has an angular momentum, so it is rotating. So when you have a rotating ball of gas and you are collapsing it, then it is unlikely, then due to the conservation of angular momentum, the collapsing material do not come to a single central core, rather it forms a disk. So this formation of the central core, or like increasing of the size of the central core, actually consists of 2 parts: the collapse of the envelope onto the disk-like structure, and then the accretion of mass through the disk to the central core, or the protostellar core. And while this is happening, what also happens is that since it's a collapse, a lot of gravitational energy is being released, and so that heats up the core as well as the surrounding regions. And however, since this molecular cloud consists of both gas and dust. Dust, as you recall, has the property that it extinguishes all the wavelengths which are smaller than say something like 1 micron. So all optical radiation that is coming out of the core will be absorbed by the dust, and that heats up the dust. So in the next stage, so as this continues, but then there is some kind of a damming up. So what you recall is that what is happening is that you have a large rotating sphere which is collapsing. Now as it is collapsing, basically it's in order to conserve its angular momentum, it will actually tend to spin up. But so which means that but that will, if it spins up, it actually will disrupt the the collapse will then get halted. But that doesn't happen, because beyond a certain point, because of a phenomenon which is called like due to some sort of instability, basically stellar or disk winds actually start breaking out along the rotational axis of the system. So if this is the disk perpendicular, so the disk will be formed perpendicular to the direction of the rotation axis. So, and it is along the rotation axis that this stellar wind or disk wind breaks out. And what it does is it carries with it a large number, large amount of material, and as well as radiation, and also like a lot of, so it disrupts the shell, the outer shell, which is and causes a, opens up some space which is in the along the direction of the rotation axis. And however, the collapse keeps happening in the outer places of the now the disrupted shell. So, but this collapse actually happens onto the accretion disk, and from the accretion disk, the matter is like flows along the accretion disk to the central protostar. And so this process of clearing up the envelope continues until in a final stage, this becomes much clearer, where we have what are called the jets or bipolar, because they are directed in opposite directions. So they around the two poles of the protostar, if you may, if you want that to be called that. So this is what you will observe in such a system. You have a central accreting core, which is the protostar, which is protostar is something which will become a star. And then there is a disk. This disk consists also of dust and gas. And because it is of dust, it has certain properties which can be observed. And also there is huge amount of gas, or along with some dust, which gets which is being sort of thrown out by the system. And this is something which helps to maintain the angular, conserve the angular momentum, in the sense, or it helps to carry out the excess angular momentum so that the central object can continue to grow. And finally, in the last stage, what happens is that the entire envelope from which the mass was accreting onto the disk is now dispersed, because it is just exhausted, or the whatever the outflowing material has actually cleared it off. And this is the final stage of the star, where we see the star along with the disk, and there are bipolar outflows. So this is not really the star that we see. So this is the final stage of the final stage of, I would say, evolution of the protostar. And we will later see that, okay, the stars do not show this bipolar outflow. We will see how that continues. So this phase of star formation is called the T Tauri phase. Now notice, I'd like to draw your attention to the header that I have given. It's called formation of low mass stars. So what do I mean by low mass stars? Low mass stars are stars which are less massive than, say, 3 solar mass. So our understanding currently is that such stars actually form in this way. And why do we think that they form this way? We also have, because we are able to sort of do the physics calculations of all these stages and make the prediction what after certain years this star would look like, this protostar would look like, and that we can do for the low mass star. And we have actually a one-to-one correlation, or one-to-one corroboration of this star formation theoretical calculations in the form of observation. So here what you see is a prototype of a young star. So these very young protostellar objects are they were named, well, many of them were identified by Harbig and Harrow, two astrophysicists. And this one has the number Harbig Harrow 30. And what you see is, and if you compare this image with the model that I had shown earlier, you see that there is almost a one-to-one correlation with what you see, what you observe, and what the model predicts. So what you see here basically is a thin, dark disk. So this disk is dark. So the dark disk is somewhere here, the midline, which is, and we also see that there are jets, powerful gaseous jets, which is identical to what we have in the model. The central star here is hidden from direct view because the disk, as I say, it has dust, and whenever there is dust, we cannot see it in optical or even in near infrared. We need to observe it at much longer wavelengths. And the upper and lower, these two kind of surfaces which seem to be a little brighter, they actually reflect the light that is emitted by the central protostar, and they are actually the parts of the disk. So the green thing is the gas jet. So what we see is that we have an almost one-to-one corroboration of our understanding of the formation of low mass stars with what we observe in nature. So that makes us very happy that we know we are able to sort of build models and reproduce what we observe. So, and then continuing on, what happens to this star? Like, as I said, so in the normal stars, we do not see these outflows. So as this star becomes older, if you look at the timeline, so this is now at 1 to 10 million years. Basically, we have the star and we would have this circumstellar disk around it. So, and it is from this, so this is still what is called a pre-main sequence star. So it is likely that the star has not started. So because it's a low mass star, it does not start burning hydrogen yet. So this is the light that we are seeing, the radiation that we are seeing is mostly from the release of gravitational energy. So then when this star, there are these disks, and now it is the disk. There are a lot of things which will happen in the disk, and then there will be some parts of the disk which will fragment out, and the planets are actually formed in the disk, and the remaining part of the disk is dispersed away by winds and also the ultraviolet radiation from the star. And so this is how a star and associated planets are formed. So this disk, which is the remnant part of the disk, is called a debris disk. Debris is something which you like, it's a remnant of something. And so this is finally a main sequence star after about 10 million years, and a star with its planets around it. So this is a mature and stable planetary system. So this is how we can sort of go from the formation, from the molecular cloud to the formation of planets. There are certain things which we still do not understand, is how these planets are forming here itself. I will talk about that. I will not go too much into the details, but give you a glimpse of what our understanding is currently. Okay, so now, if there are any quick questions, I can answer.
There are no questions, ma'am.
Okay, so let me just continue. So now, as you understand that if something is evolving, then there will also, as astronomers, when we are looking at objects, there will always be some objects which are at a certain stage, one stage of evolution, and the others at different stages of evolution. So then how do we know? So this is, but then as astronomers, what we observe is the spectrum, like spectral energy distribution, like how the intensity of the flux of the object increases or decreases or changes as a function of frequency or wavelength. And so here what we see is that you can see that this shows the continuum spectra for different for stars or protostars at different stages of their evolution. So this is when there is basically basically the total envelope is collapsing. And here what you see is that most of the emission is in the lower frequencies, which means longer wavelengths. So this is more of a cold object. But once this system has formed, that where you have outflows and there is a central star and a disk, this is what the emission looks like. And this is called, so as the age progresses, such protostars are classified into class 0, class 1, class 2, class 3. And when it's at class 1, then there is, what one sees is that there is an emission. We observe the emission from the protostar as well as the emission from the active disk. And based on their characteristic features, like how they vary with frequency, we are able to tell that this part arises from the disk and this part arises from the protostar. And finally, when the disk, when the outflow is completely gone and the protostar is somewhere here and there is a flared disk, like it's often that the protostar becomes sort of hidden, but then and the disk is no longer, so there is, so here you see that it is written passive disk, which means that the disk is there, it is just illuminated by the protostar, but there is not active accretion occurring from the disk. So this is how it goes. And as you can see that starting from this kind of a spectrum, we arrive at this kind of a spectrum as the system evolves. And there is a way to quantify this thing. This is once again done by the power law. So it is, or the spectral index. So you just calculate the ratio of the, basically you estimate that the flux that is being observed is proportional to, so nu times, so basically this is integrated over the area, is proportional to mu to the power minus alpha, and then we estimate how this alpha varies for the different spectra that I have drawn here. And so this is, so when you have a class of objects, or you have a lot of objects and you want to classify, you just want some marker, like you want to say that, okay, I will measure the slope of the curve between this wavelength and this wavelength, and if it is this, I will call it class 1. If it is between say minus 1.5 to 0, then I will call it class 2, and then if it's less than minus 1.5, I will call it class 3. So this is a way the astronomers or observers actually classify these various various stages of protostellar formation. Okay, now, so I've told you, given a very qualitative picture, and I just want you to be, to make you a bit aware of what are the physics issues involved when we are considering star formation problems, because all that I showed in the models, etc., they actually are based on physics. So now consider the problem. Basically what is happening is that we have, say, a star, we have a gas cloud, which is about 1 parsec, so which is of the order of 10 to the 18 centimeter, which we are collapsing to the size of a star. So, well, say a star or maybe a planetary system. So it's like, you see that we are sort of compressing the whole thing from 10 to the 18 to about 10 to the 11 centimeters. So it's a huge change in dimensions. And there is a corresponding increase in density by a factor of 10 to the 21. So you see that the range of physics that we have to, or the range of physical conditions that our equations have to represent, or equations have to reproduce, the results that we have to reproduce is really vast. Now there are, so now we talked about this, these clouds which are, say, in virial equilibrium and things like that. So what stops a cloud from actually collapsing always? So because there is always a pull of gravity, so there are several factors, and I think we have discussed in bits and pieces. These things have come up repeatedly in our lecture, in my lectures. So there is a resistance which is due to the pressure, and the primary resistance for such a cloud would be the gas pressure and also the magnetic pressure. So the magnetic pressure, let me talk about the magnetic pressure first. The magnetic pressure comes from, because as I said, there is an all-pervasive magnetic field on a galactic scales, and as I say, and I also said that what is the exact origin of the field is not understood, but how this field actually gets regenerated, there are some sort of dynamo theories which can explain most of the observed features reasonably well. So anyways, any collapsing cloud also has a magnetic field. Now what does a magnetic field do? So magnetic field, actually, if there are magnetic fields, and if there are like ionized particles, or if there are electrons and ions, then what happens is that they tend to move along the magnetic field lines, right? That is the tendency. But the neutrals are not affected. But then, so the thing is that we do, but what happens is that when this, so if the magnetic field, and you know that magnetic field lines remain then actually frozen in the matter. So if they are always, if these electrons and ions are not able to cross the magnetic field lines, then how are they going to collapse to a point? So which means that this magnetic field actually sort of would resist the collapse. And if you consider basically the pressure that is created due to the magnetic flux, that is the magnetic pressure. And so that to some extent would resist the gravitational collapse. But then in spite of this, and the young stars actually do show magnetic fields. But in spite of that, we do see gravitational collapse. How does that happen? The thing to remember is that the degree, how much the magnetic field is effective depends on the degree of ionization of the medium of the collapsing cloud. And in this, when the degree of ionization is not much, then what happens is that most of the material is neutral, and the neutral material is not bound to the magnetic field. It's only the ions which are bound to the magnetic field. So what happens is that due to the gravitational pull, the neutral material can actually cross the magnetic field lines and move towards the center of higher gravity, center of high density. And often what happens is that they also pull the ions and try to pull the ions along with them. But now, if there is mostly material which is neutral, then what happens is that when if they continue to collapse, the size of the net size of the cloud becomes smaller, which means that the magnetic field, like although the magnetic field strength remains the same, the magnetic flux decreases, because that depends on the magnetic field strength times the square of the radius of the object. So as a result of it, if the magnetic flux reduces, then the magnetic pressure decreases, and as a result of which, then the gravitation can take over. So this process of relative motion of the ions and the neutrals is called ambipolar diffusion. So this is a diffusive process. And the other thing is, of course, as I said, that everything is rotating. So if they are rotating very fast, then they cannot collapse. So rotation also provides some kind of a support. But however, all of the angular momentum of this collapsing gas has to be taken out before the protostellar objects can form and accrete. And this is called the angular momentum problem. And the way it is done is, as I mentioned, that the angular momentum is carried away by the material which goes out or in the bipolar direction. So these outflows and jets take away the angular momentum. Then I'll talk a bit more about the radiation pressure a bit in detail. So radiation pressure often is, as you heard earlier, that radiation pressure actually decides on the largest star that you can build. If the radiation pressure is too much, it can no longer, the gravitational force can no longer hold the object together. So there must be some limits. And I think I mentioned this limit also. So basically, if you consider a star formation region, it is emitting radiation. And so initially the radiation would be coming from the gravitational energy which is being released, and that comes from the accretion and that results in the luminosity. So we can write down the luminosity due to the gravitational collapse, and then we write that as dm by r into m dot. M dot is the rate of transfer of mass transfer. And if we plug in, if we put in the various numbers, so these notations, if you recall, they are for solar masses. So in astronomy, we often write many expressions like this, because then it becomes very easy. So which means that if I have a cloud which is 1 solar mass of 1 solar radius and has mass falling, like a rate of accretion of mass of 10 to the minus 6 solar mass per year, then the gravitational luminosity that I will be creating will be something like 120 solar luminosity. So which means that this is the gravitational luminosity is that the luminosity of the radiation that is coming out due to the release of gravitational energy. So this is the 120 solar luminosity is the luminosity. Now, this is when there is no fusion at the center. But once the central density and temperature becomes high enough, then nuclear fusion starts, and then this luminosity increases by a huge amount. And what happens is that, so once this becomes very large, then what happens, the radiation that is streaming away on the star, so radiation exerts a pressure, and that force is exerted on all the gas like atoms and ions and molecules or the dust particles. Dust particles, as you recall, are much larger. So they are like agglomerates of molecules. So they are up to 1 micron in size. So then these dust particles have what I've written as that they have large radiation pressure cross section, which means that they actually face the radiation pressure is exerted on them. So so now we have another pressure mechanism which is pushing the material which is falling in. And if we calculate the limit, so we have a force due to gravity and we have a force being exerted due to the radiation pressure. And if we put in the right numbers, so we can show that these two forces become comparable for a stellar mass of which is greater than or equal to 10 solar mass. What does it mean? That if the stellar mass is more than 10 solar mass, then this radiation pressure will stop further accretion of material, but further accretion of mass, which means that we cannot be creating stars which are of mass larger than this. But this is not true, because we do see stars which are of much larger size. And the way to understand how this radiation pressure is overcome is to remember remember that, so when in the beginning, when we saw that basically there is a collapse happening, the outer envelope is collapsing sort of spherically symmetrically, but then we also had the disk which is formed. So, and the central star is actually accreting through the accretion disk, and this is a cross section of that accretion disk. Here you have the central core which is formed, and these are the various parts of the disk. And so the material which is falling here actually is channeled through the disk, and then it falls onto the central core that is formed. And but also what happens is that there is dust in this disk, and so it is the luminosity of this core which is expected to create that radiation pressure, which will prevent further infall of gas and dust, and so which may halt the accretion. But what happens in this case is that because the luminosity, because what the radiation of the star here is being absorbed by the dust in here, so this disk gives somewhat a protection to the material which is coming in from this side, and so the strong radiation luminosity of this core is not seen by the pressure due to that, is not seen by the material which is accreting through the accretion disk. So basically this, so the accreting matter is shielded from the short wavelength radiation from this accreting stellar object. And this is, this is basically a cross-sectional view of the disk that we had seen earlier when we made this, when we had looked into the different stages of star formation. So this sort of helps us to understand. So this part is protected, and also some of the radiation pressure is effectively collimated away into the bipolar outflows, which go obviously perpendicular to this direction. So some of the radiation is carried away through these in this direction, and the radiation which is coming in this direction is actually absorbed by the dust which is on the accretion disk very close to it. So the material can keep still falling onto this disk. So this part remains relatively unaffected, and the accretion can continue, and then slowly between this from this dust disk to the pure gas disk, the accretion continues onto the central core. Okay, yeah, if there are questions, I'll stop.
Yes, ma'am, there are two questions.
Yes.
One is, this is from slide number 5, I guess.
Yeah, okay.
The next slide.
This one.
Is there any reason for taking the values like 4.7 and 2.7, where the relation is given?
Well, yeah, so it is 4.7 is basically these are wavelengths. So these are basically these are various bands of the photometric observations. So this 2.2 micron band. So when one measures this spectrum, it's not a continuous spectrum that we measure, but there are different basically bands in which the telescopes are able to observe. So this is a mid-infrared band, and this is a near-infrared band, and the comparison. So the slope between these two. So it is expected. So there is a reason, first of all, that if you consider the the spectral energy distribution from a disk, you expect it to behave in a certain way, disk or the accreting star or an envelope, and so based on that these two are chosen, and the particular values are because these are the wavelengths at which you can make observations. It's not that you have a continuous wavelength coverage. Instruments are built at particular wavelengths in order to make them the results comparable and reproducible. Okay.
Okay. One more question. When stars are formed, mostly the interior contains ions. Then how can gravitational force of attraction overcome electromagnetic forces between?
No. How can gravitational? No. So, but there is some kind.
How can gravitational force?
Inside of the stars there is iron, but as you realize, the core is. It need not be initially ionized. It becomes ionized once it completely well, definitely when it's fusing, it's undergoing nuclear fusion, it will be ionized. But otherwise, it's the material. As I said, the molecular cloud itself is not mostly ionized. It has a non-negligible fraction of ionization, but it's not fully ionized. So I hope I understood the question right.
Yes, ma'am. I think
okay.
That's what.
Yeah. Okay. So let me just continue. So, yes. So having understood some of the physics issues of studying star formation, let's see now. So as we saw that there is already we see some signs of issues when the mass of the accreting pores becomes very large, that there will be radiation pressure which might affect. So, and if you recall, I have been talking about formation of low mass stars, and I said that theory is well understood, and because we have a one-to-one corroboration with observations. So, but then what happens in the high mass stars? For the high mass stars, the main difference is that when you have a larger mass, the dynamical time scales are much shorter, which means that it collapses faster, and then and so this is what happens when a high mass star forms. So here, if you neglect, so this is how we understand now that from a molecular cloud, from various ways, how these initial cores around which the stars will form start. So you can consider that, so these are the small massive dense cores, and then if you consider all this massive dense core, this is what happens to it, because the star is actually collapsing very fast. Even when the outer envelope, like full spherical envelope of consisting of dust and gas, remains there, the central core starts to fuse, already starts to produce, undergo nuclear fusion. So there is a lot of energy which just a minute, yeah. So this is where okay, now even now that it's just protostellar accretion, but then the time scale between the total collapse and the increase in temperature at the center to enable a nuclear reaction. So if you compare these two, what we see is that these nuclear reactions start very soon, and even before the entire envelope has collapsed to a certain degree. So which means that we have a sort of full-fledged star, because we'll call an object a star whenever it starts to undergo nuclear burning. So if it starts to do that and produces a lot of luminosity, although the outer envelope is still around it and it's still collapsing, or rather trying to collapse. So now, so that's what I've written here. So which means that there are some issues in identifying or in carrying out the steps that we identified for the low mass star formation. The core becomes so dense and hot to fuse hydrogen even while the gravitational collapse continues. So there's outer envelope. So if you recall, there were two phases. One is the gravitational collapse and the other is accretion. So even before this collapse ends, then the central object becomes very dense and hot, and it starts to fuse. But what also happens is that because it is now always enshrouded, like it is always embedded inside a dust and a cloud consisting of dust and gas, it becomes very difficult to observe it. In the previous case, you saw that the envelope was being dispersed of by the outflow, etc., very effectively, so that there were openings and we could observe through them. So now this central object, we have no way of observing. What we can observe is basically the reprocessed radiation. So this star is not visible to us in any, this protostar is not visible to us in most wavelengths. We can only observe the radiation that is emitted by the reprocessed radiation that is emitted by the dust and gas cloud around it. And so as a result, we never get to see the stages that we see in the low mass stars for the high mass stars, and we are not aware of how things progress. And then there is also the issue of that. So now we have a situation where the radiation pressure, because we already have the nuclear fusion at the center, there is the amount of radiation luminosity that is coming out of the center is huge, and that would create a lot of radiation pressure, and that actually it's very difficult to theoretically come up with ideas which will effectively carry away the radiation in a way that this radiation pressure cannot halt the formation of large stars. So there are various techniques people use. So as you can see, that's the first stage of the star where we can have an idea that, okay, a high mass star has formed, is when already we see the star in this stage. So this, and it has ionized all the gas around it, and that is called the H+ or H2 region. And it is only at this stage you see that it has only about 0.1 to 1 million years have elapsed. If you recall that for the other the low mass stars, it was beyond 10 million years that we could see we were seeing that the star has started to fuse. So undergo nuclear fusion. So basically mechanisms. So it is not easy to explain the formation of high mass stars considering a scaled up version of the formation theory of the low mass stars. Okay. So are there any questions on this?
No, ma'am.
Okay, so high mass star formation, just to summarize, because of the theoretical considerations as well as the constraints in identify or means in observing such high mass stars, they are relatively poorly understood. And the other thing I must mention is that most of the high mass stars actually form in clusters. So you will be able to it is possible to sort of understand the evolution of an isolated cloud, but when it is forming along with other stars, then obviously they would be affected by the environment, and that makes it a more complicated problem to solve. Okay, now let us sort of start going towards planets. As I said in the earlier stage, that basically the planets are formed in the protostellar disk. So when you had the protostar at the center and you had the disk, and that disk actually matured, and then it becomes what we call the protoplanetary disk, and from in that the disk planets form. I'm giving you a very sort of I would say a really scheming view, a bird's eye view of what we understand of planet formation nowadays. So people actually work on how planets form from these disks, which are like of gas and dust, which are there when a star is formed. So there are basically two accepted paradigms or two accepted models. Which one of them is called core accretion, and the other is called gravitational instability. In the core accretion model, basically the way it works is that it's basically it is that the smaller objects, they move in the protoplanetary disk, and they keep gathering basically material around them. It's much like if you have a cold, it's a snowball effect like thing. If you have a cold thing which is moving through a material, and then because it is cold, it will gather material, will stick on its top, and its size will increase. So that is how a snowball is made. Like you make a small snowball and then you roll it on snow, and then the size increases. So this is called a bottom-up approach. So then finally you have a large enough object which is planet-like, and then that's the one way. And the other theory says that basically these exoplanets, the first object that are formed, that directly they are like kilometer size objects, and those are called planetesimal. So instead of starting from very small, say dust-like objects or large dust particle-like things, you already start with objects which are called planetesimal. So anything smaller than the planet. And these are like more like kilometer size objects, and it is from those that basically the more the future planets are formed. And so and how do these planets these planetesimals form? They form due to some gravitational instability. So that a way to understand is that there might be some local things happening which cause an increase in density and sort of fragment the part of the disk fragments out. So this disk is made of gas and dust, so it fragments out to form these chunks known as planetesimals. But there are also issues. So this is not a solved problem per se, like because we using these two methods, primarily these two methods, it's not possible to explain the existence of all the types of planets that we see so far. So, and for example, for the first one, there is an issue that, so the first one, assume that you have a very small particle which rolls and makes these big particles, but then it is difficult to form a rocky planet. So there are a lot of planets which are gas giants, like they have primarily gas and they are gigantic, like big planets like Jupiter, Saturn, but they have a rocky core. So, and in order for that to happen at the time scales of this core accretion, by the time such gas giants would be built, if you just have core accretion, the gas in the disk, the initial protoplanetary disk will dissipate by that time. So there is a time scale issue between the two. Similarly, for the gravitational instability theory, so if it is it gets also difficult. It becomes difficult to form objects like Neptune, because it will be because they will actually, it will take too long to form objects which are very far from the star, and so there are time scale issues in both these types. So I am not talking about all the problems that exist or all the successes of these theories, but just to give you an idea so that you can look up, okay, this may be some topic I am interested in, and I can read a bit further on this. So now that we have learned, like, we have learned that how we understand the formation of planets. Let's move over to planets that are seen around other stars. So these are called exoplanets. So as I said, these are stars, these are planets which are orbiting around stars other than our sun. And like our sun, any star may harbor one or more planets. So what has happened in the past few years, a fantastic thing, which is basically something which we have achieved in the last 11 to 12 years. Although first discovery of exoplanets was in the late like 1990s. So, but then since then, because of some space missions, which I will mention briefly at the end, a large number of planets around other stars have been discovered. So, and as of now, there are 4,375 confirmed exoplanets. Why I say confirmed as opposed to candidates? There are a lot of objects which have been proposed to be planets, but then they require some further verification in order to say that they are really planets. We will see what they might involve. So, one of the motivations for studying exoplanets is that the exoplanets actually, since they are moving in the gravitational field of the host stars, they also help us to understand the stars better. They also could be throwing some light on the formation mechanism of our solar system and the Earth. And obviously, we are interested to know if there are Earth-like systems elsewhere around some other stars, and there are life as we know it in other places in the universe. So it is a matter of high curiosity. I think at some point, all of us think about it, that, okay, are we alone? Like, what makes us so special? It can't be, right? So there must be other sort of civilizations or life in some form in some other place in the universe. So that sort of motivates the study of exoplanets. Now, it's not very easy to observe the exoplanets. So there is a huge challenge. So in order to show that, this is what is called a lighthouse, right? These are the structures you see in the middle of the sea, which help the ship to navigate to know which way they are. So this is the this is the lighthouse, the light of the lighthouse being on, and it is somewhat similar to the stars, which are maybe 1 billion times brighter than the planet or the firefly, as in this case, which is when the light of the lighthouse was on, we would not have seen this small firefly. Right, so the planet is actually similar. When the star, in the presence of the star, the planet is so tiny, it remains hidden in the glare. So that poses a huge observational challenge, because we can see the star very easily. It's possible, but how do we see the planet in the presence of the star? Well, we have been clever, and there are various ways. The first way, of course, is that, okay, you switch off the lighthouse, that is the direct imaging. So switching off the lighthouse is equivalent to blocking the star itself. So this is called something called a corona. So you do that with a corona, like putting a mask over the star. And this is actually an image. This is called the technique of direct imaging. This is an actual image where the star has been blocked, and you see that the star would have been so much brighter. In the presence of it, we would not have seen this much fainter planet. But here, it has been possible to observe a planet like this. But of course, this requires certain configurations of the planet relative to the star, etc. And it's not a very straightforward thing to do always. So here I have listed a number of methods, and I will just be talking about some of them and not all. But just I will mention briefly about one technique, which is called gravitational microlensing. I won't go too much into the details, because this also involves somewhat involves some theory related to general relativity. So, but the thing to understand is that, so if you know the term gravitational lens, so that is to tell that a massive object it acts like a lens, because if it is very massive, it is able to bend light. So it acts like a lens. So using that concept, so there are actually examples of lensing of galaxies due to large clusters of galaxies. And similarly, so here you see the example, but here we are talking about micro lensing, which means that the effects are very small. So here what you see is that there are two stars, and what the observation suggests is that, so when the star in front passes through the line of sight towards the star in the background, there is a change in the brightness of that we observe, and that is affected by that is sort of, so it is not just the adding up of the energies or the intensities of the two stars, but also there is a further enhancement due to the lensing effect. So if you are curious, just I can refer you to some other articles which you can read and find out, but I do not have time to go into the details. So in the same spirit, so here you see the case, you have the star and you also have a planet going around it. So for the foreground star, there is a planet going around it. So if due to the star, the enhancement in brightness is like this, due to the planet, which is also a small mass, but massive object due to the, and which acts as a gravitational lens, then there is a small spike. So this is magnified here. So this part is magnified. So this shows the magnification by the stellar lens, magnification of the star at the background by the stellar lens, and the small spikes shows the deviation due to the planet. So, so if we observe such configurations and we are able to detect these small spikes, then we will be able to say that, okay, there are planets which are going, there is a planet which is going around, or there are planets which are going around the foreground star. But this, once again, as you realize, is a question of the sort of alignment of two things and relative to our line of sight. The more common method, and I will talk briefly about it because this has been done in some sense in the other parts of the course. And so this is called the radial velocity or Wobble method. And we have been discussing this, right? Two gravitating objects in the same system. They are moving, they would be moving about their barycenter, which is the center of mass. And as I mentioned, as I think we have done that in detail, that is basically even the heavier object will actually go around the center of mass in a smaller radius compared to the lighter object. So if we consider this picture here, the bigger red blob, circle is the star, and this gray small circle is the center of mass of the system or the barycenter of the system, and the blue circle is the planet. So this is how they are going about each other. But then notice one thing. So if this is their motion, so then now if we keep observing the star, so now why is the star moving like this? It is because of the presence of the planet. If the star were on its own, then it would not have been making this orbital motion around the center of mass. It is due to the gravitational field, the gravitational interaction with the planet that it is making this motion. So, and what happens to the star? Although it is making undergoing a small motion, for part of the orbit, it is actually moving away from the Earth, and for the remaining part, it is actually coming towards the Earth. So now you recall that whenever something is moving away and towards us, what we always use is that, okay, there will be a shift in the frequency of the spectral lines which are emitted by that object. And so, and it's a star, and for stars, we have repeatedly been talking about spectral lines which get Doppler shifted. So we will actually observe spectra which get Doppler shifted. So now what does the Doppler shift tell us? The Doppler shift, as you know, depends on the velocity along the line of sight. So this is actually a measure of the orbital velocity. So using this, we are able to determine the amplitude and also the period of the stars. This is called, and this motion of the star, small motion of the star around the barycenter is called its wobble. So, and this amplitude and period of the star's wobble velocity then tells us about the characteristics of the orbit, and also tells us about the mass, because if you recall the derivations that we did, that we are able to connect the two masses and the orbital sizes, and then in order to, then we write the equations down. So these are the parameters of the orbit and the mass of the planet that we are able to determine if we know the mass of the star well, right? There are two masses in the system. If we know the stellar mass well, we will know the mass of the planet also well. However, there are some limitations. It actually requires pretty high signal to noise ratio, like it has to be bright enough. And also what we have to realize is that, so this is an orbital motion, and then it depends on how the orbit is oriented relative to us. Is it face on, or is it located edge on? Depending on that, we will be measured, because it is the inclination of the orbit which will decide on the fraction of the orbital velocity that we'll be measuring, because we can only measure velocity which is along the radial direction, like which is coming away directly towards us or away from us. So, but if, due to the inclination of the orbit, we will always measure V, the velocity, times sine of the inclination angle, and we do not have a handle on the sine. So we can only get a limit on the So because we do not measure this clearly, we can only determine a limit on the lower limit to the planet mass. So and also the other thing is that if suppose the star itself fluctuates because of it has some variability, then this is not a good star in which we can use this method. So this method is used as we will see in combination of the more popular method, which is the method of planetary transits. I'm sure you have seen this sometimes with Venus on the surface of the Earth, like you see that Venus transit of Venus. So which means that when Venus actually passes through the disk of the sun, and it looks like a black spot on the disk of the sun, and when we look from the Earth. So similar things must be happening to the star planet systems elsewhere, because the planet is moving around the star, and if we are looking at the star, then sometimes the planet must be between us and the star. However, we do not resolve the stars, like we do not see the disk of the planet, so a disk of the star clearly, we do not see it at all. We just look at it, that's a point. But then what happens is that, so it actually causes a very small decrease in the stellar brightness, because what is happening when it is here and if we are observing, so for us observers, it is actually blocking that part of the stellar light. So if that happens, then it means that the measured light that, so here this shows that what happens here. If this is the level of brightness that we measure from the star, then in the presence, so here you consider that in this, here the planet is in this part of its orbit, but when it is directly in front of the star, between the star and us, then what it happens is it absorbs part of the stellar radiation, and as a result of it, there we see a dip in the brightness that we measured. So this is a plot of the brightness as a function of time. So which means that as long as the planet is blocking some part of the stellar light, we keep seeing the blocking, and then as the planet moves away from the line of sight between the star and us, then it once again we start seeing only the star. So this is the kind of pattern that we would keep saying. And now as we understand that as the planet goes round and round, every time this configuration is reached, we will see a dip. So if we measure this brightness of the star as a function of time, we will keep seeing these dips appearing as periodically, because that is related to the period of the planet around the star. Okay, so now obviously what this requires is that you need to do very precise photometry, which means that you should be able, if this dip, so here the dip obviously is for the sake of demonstration, it has been shown to be very exaggerated. It could be a very small dip, and it will be a very small dip. So you need to know these very well, precisely measure it very precisely in order to detect these small dips. And so now, and also one other thing we have to remember is that once again, the occurrence and detection of this transit depends on the alignment of the orbital plane and the line of sight. Once again, that same thing comes up. So if the circle is like this, or if the circle is like that, so it could be, if in the sense the orbit is like that, so then we would expect basically the pattern that we see here to slightly change. And also it matters if the planet is, say, very small, then it will be actually blocking very small amount of the stellar radiation, and which the dip will be then very tiny, and we may or may not be able to detect it. So that basically the depth of this absorption feature depends on the relative size of the star and planet. And so these are some of the things which one has to take into account. So now just to give you an idea about what are the parameters that can be derived from such a measurement. So the total transit depth, the depth of this absorption gives us the ratio of the stellar to planetary radius. Why is it radius? Because as you recall, you would understand that basically we are measuring the flux that we are receiving from the star. So that is the basically it is over the entire disk of the star, that is pi r square, that goes as pi r square. And but then the planet is actually blocking, say, pi r planet square type amount of area from the star. So that part is being removed. So it is the relative, so this depth will depend on rp square divided by r square. So it is a ratio of it. So this dip actually gives us the relative radii of the star and the planet. And secondly, what you see is that, so how this, whether this is like a square pattern or whether this will never be like a square pattern, but whether it goes down like this or whether it goes down like this depends on the inclination of the orbit. So this is called the ingress. That is when the star to some extent, and then when it stops, when it goes out of the disk of the star. So these are the two places, and these are the two positions. And so looking at this inclination, so calculating this thing, it is possible to determine the inclination of the orbit. And as we had discussed earlier, in the radial velocity or Wobble method, our main constraint in giving the planetary mass was that we did not know the inclination. So if we make the transit observation of the same star planet system and determine the orbital inclination, then we will be able to give a better estimate of the planetary mass. So here are some of the things that we can measure, and they are using a combination of these methods. First of all, say the wobble or this transit period, it gives us the orbit size, because that you know that the period is a very easy thing to measure, and that tells us how far this planet is relative to the star. Secondly, the transit depth, as I told you, gives us the ratio of the planet size to the star size. So if we know the size of the star, we can determine the size of the planet. The duration of the ingress and egress gives us the inclination of the planet orbit. And once we know the planet orbit, we can improve our estimate of the planet of the mass, mass of the planet from that we have obtained from Wobble. And having known the size and the mass, we can derive a mean density for the planet, and the density is also a clue to the composition. And finally, so because the density, say if it is a rocky planet or a gas giant, so the densities will be very different. So this is the kind of thing that we derive from using these numbers. And finally, the orbit of the planet, like how far is it from the star, tells us how hot the planet would be. And then that also tells us whether it is in the habitable zone. That if the planet is too close to the star, then it will be too warm for life to exist. So these are the things, that parameters that we can derive from based on these observations, such observations. And since I have told you a bit about composition, of course, the planets would also consist of atmospheres. And so there are other methods. I'll just be very brief about it, but to give you an idea, the other type of observations that one makes is of the planetary atmosphere, because the success of our Earth as a heaven for life lies in the fact that we have an atmosphere. So like if the planet loses its atmosphere, then it becomes difficult to sustain life. So the rocky planets with atmospheres are a good place. So basically we have we are curious about the atmosphere, and there are two ways to determine what might be the atmosphere. So one is that, so once again, you have the star and you have the planet going around it. So when the planet is in front of the star, so basically what happens is that, so if you recall, when we were doing the radiative transfer equation, we were considering that we have a source, a continuum source, and we have some gas cloud in the front. So now the planet is itself not fully, like the light cannot pass through, but then the atmosphere is what part? Atmosphere is basically the outer shell of a planet, and that is much thinner than say the density of our Earth is a lot larger than the atmosphere itself. So if someone was observing the Earth from outside, then obviously the outer layers would be like a diffuse gas cloud. So the radiation that is coming from the star will shine through the atmosphere of the planet. And when that happens, we will be able to see the absorption lines due to the elements or the molecules which are present in the atmosphere. And so this is used big time to try to understand or look for signs of life, because there are some biomarkers which have been identified, and people try to look for them in order to understand whether there is life or in the there is life as we understand it in the planet. The other thing which also happens is that, so this blue shell is what we are seeing. The spectrum is due to the blue shell on this planet. But now what happens when the planet is behind the star? So then the light is shining on this planet. And then this is like our art, it will reflect. So the reflection will also give rise to a spectrum. And so that will tell us about the reflectivity of the planet. And that helps us to also decide on the temperature of the planet and things like that. So we do understand, or we do have ways to access various information about the planets, their mass, size, radius, distance from the star, as well as density. Okay, so now this is a summary slide which shows you that there have been a lot of planets have been discovered so far, and this shows how their planets, how their periods are. This is for the exoplanets. So this shows a plot of the masses in terms of Jupiter masses and their periods. As you can see that these have very large periods. So ideally, what we are looking for is basically Earth-like planets, and so that's the goal. And the other thing, and this color coding actually shows you which planets, which of the methods are used mostly to detect the planets. And often many of the planets are first detected using transits, because transits are the easiest to measure. And then to get a very better idea about the size of the orbit, etc., it is possible one does a radial velocity measurement if the planet is so positioned related to the star. And this shows us that how many of the detections have happened. How many of the detections have happened using the different methods of exoplanet detection. And as you can see, that this shows this very clearly, that most of them have been detected using transits, and the red one is a slowly increasing number, because for these planet candidates often, or these are planets, or the candidates are often identified in transits, so they are verified using the radial velocity measurements. And before stopping, I just wanted to make you aware that where did all these data come from? In between 2009 to 2018, NASA had launched a telescope called Kepler Space Telescope, which actually contributed a lot to the discovery of a large number of planets. The data is still on, and people are working on the data. As I say, that it is possible to identify a lot of planetary candidates have been identified, but they have to be verified. Right now, around 4,300 exoplanets, there are confirmed exoplanets. Could you please mute yourself? So,
Gopika, please mute yourself, or we'll remove you from the room.
So just please mute her. So, so then. This is so this is the telescope. Okay, so basically, so this is the first telescope, which was Kepler telescope, space telescope. This is actually the treasure trove of most of the planets which have been discovered so far. Then now the currently operational telescope is called the Transiting Exoplanet Survey Satellite TESS. It was launched in 2018 and it's still operational. And so both of these, what they actually do is they keep observing the sky repeatedly, so continuously and simultaneously, monitoring a large number of stars, so that because what we understand that in order to detect this transition, it is necessary to observe, to derive very accurate photometry, which means that we need to measure the intensity that is coming from the star and its variation very accurately, and that requires long-term monitoring of the star. Okay, so I will stop here and take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, ma'am. So the first question is, can transit method be used to measure the mass of exoplanets?
The mass of exoplanets is determined. No, the transit method cannot be used, as I said. So you have to understand what does so it is basically the blocking effect. So it basically gives you a ratio of the radii of the star and the planet. The mass actually comes from the Wobble method, because that is based on dynamics. So whenever you have the mechanics or the dynamics of the system, that gives you the mass. But as I said, the mass from the radial velocity method, this is limited by our knowledge of the inclination of the orbit And the transit method, on the other hand, tells us the inclination of the orbit. So it helps us to improve our estimate of mass from the radial velocity. Yes.
Okay. So the next question is, why does the transit brightness versus time curve have a U shape, has a U shape? Is it because of the luminosity, as luminosity varies as function of R?
No, there is no, this is not. So this is like if you block something with a, so you can try doing this. So ideally, say, suppose if it is a very hard cutoff. So what exactly is happening here? So the thing is that it depends on how, so that's where this part is important to understand how we are inclined relative to the orbit, or how the orbit is inclined relative to us. So there will be a projection effect of the orbit. So otherwise it should have been a square. Like if there was an exact cutoff where you start seeing the planet on the surface of the star, and then it would have been an absolute square well kind of thing. But otherwise it is just basically because when as it enters, so depending on where you are looking at it from, it will be partially blocking the radiation, but then only when it is fully inside, and that depends on our, so when we consider it to be fully blocking the radiation that is coming from the star, then we'll see the maximum. So it's an effect. So the U shape is an effect of the inclination of the orbit with our line of sight.
Okay. The next question is about the theories of planet formation that we talked about. So one of them is, do the theories of planet formation also include theories of formation of various moons?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but then it depends on. So I'm not in a position to give you a very like I would say a very like holistic overview of which theory does fully. So they have some predictions, but how well verified those are, I'm not sorry, I cannot give you an accurate answer. I'll try to put it up on YouTube by making myself a bit more knowledgeable about this.
The next question is, do binary stars form together, or do they become part of binaries after formation?
It's mostly they form when there are so stars often form in clusters. So both types of binary formation theories exist, and so in dense clusters particularly, there is a chance that they could get into they come too close to each other, and then they form binaries. So it is so I would say they form in clusters, and then and as the system evolves, then they actually come together, but that must be pretty close to after both stars have formed.
Okay. Are there any stars which emit radiation in other wavelengths, or do all stars just emit visible light?
Okay, so you can answer this question for me actually. So what are the range of temperatures that we see in stars? And if I tell you that maybe, so the temperatures means the effective temperatures, because what the apparent temperature of the stars are basically the temperature of the last surface of the star that we can see. We cannot see deeper into the star. So basically, if you look at the stars, so we have stars between say maybe 4,000 to 40,000 Kelvin. So if you just do, and they are like quasi black bodies. So if you just take the Wien's law, then you see that where their radiation mostly happens. So primarily, so actually our sun emits a lot of radiation in the infrared, although we do see it in the, although it peaks at the in the optical wavelengths. So beyond, I'm not sure. But on the other hand, you have other exotic phenomena, like you have what are called X-ray binaries. So there will be binaries there because of some accretion mechanism in that. You have acceleration of particles, and as a result of radiation. So don't be confused by that. But the star per se, when they are, so there are high energy phenomena which are sort of somewhat extraneous to the constituents of the star, but those are sort of extreme cases. But normal, say, main sequence stars, typically you can see them only in optical and near infrared or infrared wavelengths. but there are X-ray binaries. You have neutron stars which emit, which rotate, and they are called pulsars, and then that emission is in the radio wave. So it depends on the type of phenomena. So as you probably have gathered, that there are various radiative processes, and depends on which one you're taking into account.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Just one question just popped up. I'm reading it. The two suggested methods of planet formation by core accretion and due to gravitational instability, do they have to be exclusive?
No,
Can
that
they
is a
not
good
occur?
question. Yeah, that is a very good question. It is most likely they are not exclusive. So as I said, if you know that phrase, the jury is still out on that, and both problems have. So the thing is that as you realize that there are time scale issues for both forms, both methods, and so it is possible that there are some. So they act the same mechanism happens to the same. Both mechanisms happen to the same system. So there, it's not clear that, or there is no reason to believe that they are mutually exclusive. Okay, so I just wanted to mention two things. First of all, I think it has also been mentioned that this exoplanet discovery got the Nobel Prize. So if you notice the physics Nobel Prizes for the past few years, there's been a lot of prizes due to astrophysics. So take a look at them there, because some of them you may be able to understand now, having been exposed to a bit of astrophysics. So the 2019 Nobel Prize was for the discovery of the exoplanets, but although that had happened in 1998, or the discovery in the sense of the observation of that. And the other thing is that if you have noticed it, that there was recently a news about detection of phosphine in the atmosphere of Venus. So that is one. So that was for our planet. And so when I talked about the understanding the atmospheres of exoplanets, so such studies for our planets are also interesting. And so then that helps us to understand, because why I refer to that, because when I mentioned the molecules, etc., the biomarkers, like what are the things that we consider to be due to be signs of life for such very far away systems. So when one looks into that paper, that work, where phosphine was identified to be a biomarker, because there are no natural ways of measuring so much or producing so much of phosphine. So that was one of the cases where so that could also be used for other planets. Anyway, so that's I wanted to bring these things to your attention. And one other request: just read the newspaper. There are always a lot of interesting things being talked about in sort of very simple words for astrophysics. You may or may not be able to understand all of it, but gradually you get a sense of it. And as I've probably been able to convey to you, that it's not really very high-fi physics, but some basic physics, very well-grounded, and you apply it to the astrophysical systems, and that helps you to discover the universe. Okay, so thank you so much. That's the end of the course. I hope I have been able to convey at least some of the excitement of the field to you, and feel free to write on Moodle, ask questions. The Moodle site will be on, and for the YouTube listeners also, please you can please write your questions on the chat. I am yet to post the responses for the last 3 lectures. I will do that. Please stay with us and continue with the Vigyan Leadership Program. All the best to you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bhaswati. From on the behalf of the conveners, let me also thank Professor Bhaswati Mukherjee for the course on astrophysics, which comes to an end today. So thank you very much. You have covered a wide range of phenomena of objects, the basic processes of astrophysics, and also, objects from as small as planets to the galaxy. So it's of course a very short time in 6 days lectures, but I think you have managed to give the students a good flavor of what astrophysics consists of, and you have shown them how it's basically an application of basic physics, which I hope will inspire them to take this up as a subject of further study. So thank you very much. On behalf of the conveners of Vigyan Vidushi, I thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Okay, students, if you have questions, you can post them in the chat.
We can stop the live streaming and the recording.
Yeah, you have stopped. Very good.
The live streaming needs to be stopped.